She lived as if every room were her last, and every night was some glittering promise she intended to collect before dawn. Men fell for her, women admired her or feared her, and even a British prince lost himself in the slipstream of her charm. In one era, Kiki Preston moved through Paris like a pale flame in a city already burning with modernity. In another, she stalked the Kenyan highlands with a silver syringe in her handbag. Kiki was the sort of woman who could make the world feel newly invented each time she entered a room, but who left behind a trail of devastating consequences that could never quite be swept away. Welcome to Society Mysteries. Alice Carslake Kiki Gwynn arrived on October 8, 1895, in Hempstead, New York, born not merely into privilege, but into a kind of dynastic drama. On her father's side, she was tied to the Vanderbilts, one of the great American fortunes of the 19th century, the clan that built mansions like palaces and helped define the very notion of Gilded Age power. Yet the money that surrounded her childhood was strangely vaporous. It shimmered in the distance and slipped through the fingers of the adults tasked with protecting it. Her father, Edward Erskine Gwynn Sr., enjoyed high lineage and little discipline. Affairs were mismanaged, creditors circled, and by the time Kiki was old enough to form memories, the family was already wrestling with bankruptcy proceedings and lawsuits over unpaid jewelry debts. Her father died suddenly in 1904 of kidney disease, leaving a widow, 3 children, and a storm of financial confusion that took years to unwind. Many children of that era were shuttled between continents, but for Kiki it wasn't just the scenery that changed, but a whole sense of identity. She spent her formative years between Paris, England, and occasional returns to New York, as though stability was the one luxury the Gwynns couldn't afford. She was exposed early to the cosmopolitan whirl that would later form her natural environment. Cafes alive with gossip, salons humming with artistic experiment, and the sense that life was worth living only if lived intensely. That blend of privilege and precarity formed her temperament. She was spirited, restless, and always looking for the next horizon. She even worked briefly as a cabaret performer, not from necessity, but from instinct and curiosity. Her relatives described her as clever, flirtatious, slightly reckless, and attuned to the rhythms of nightlife long before adulthood. The Gwynn children were raised for society, but Kiki seemed raised for adventure. At 23, Kiki married Horace Ransom Bigelow Allen, a young Bostonian from a respected family and a former US Army lieutenant recently discharged from the end of the First World War. The union, solemnized in 1919, had all the makings of respectability. It was the sort of Anglo-American marriage that brought together lineage, stability, and a hope for ordinary happiness. But Kiki was not built for the ordinary. The couple settled in Paris, and here the real currents of the 1920s began to shape her. Paris after the war was a magnet for expatriates who wanted release, reinvention, or oblivion. The city teemed with artists, aristocrats, culinary hedonists, and those caught between the trauma of war and the coming promise of modernity. It was in this milieu that Kiki met the people who would later lure her toward the far more infamous world of Kenya's Happy Valley set, figures like Alice de Janzé and Lord Jocelyn Hay. Her first marriage produced 2 children, Ethan in 1919 and Alice in 1921. But motherhood did not anchor her, nor did Horace, whose role in her life quickly shifted from partner to obstacle. By 1924, she filed for divorce in Paris, citing desertion. It was the first official shedding of a skin she no longer needed. Horace went on with his life, Kiki went looking for hers. In April 1925, she married Jerome Jerry Preston, a Harvard-educated broker whose personality tilted toward instinct and flamboyance. Married life with Jerry did not settle her. In fact, it launched her. Within a year, the couple were en route to British East Africa, following the siren call of a landscape that seemed a world apart from Europe's reconstructed constraints. A generous friend had offered them a parcel of land on the shores of Lake Naivasha. They accepted, built a Dutch-style farmhouse, and walked straight into one of the most notorious social communities of the 20th century. Happy Valley in the late 1920s was a playground of settlers who had slipped the leash of propriety. Here were the wealthy, the titled, the bored, and the dangerous, a society that operated as if colonial Kenya were a private stage for desires that could not be expressed at home. Drugs circulated freely, affairs overlapped with marriages, aristocrats experimented with everything from sexual freedoms to narcotics to the thrill of outrunning big game animals. Kiki fit in instantly. Her charisma made her one of the set's natural stars. She rose late, hosted feverish evenings, and reinvented dawn as the hour when she finally returned home, high on adrenaline and morphine. She and Jerry hunted lions, bred horses, entertained visiting British politicians and Hollywood actors, and seemed to live in a suspended moment where consequences were theoretical and pleasure the only currency that mattered. According to contemporaries, even Winston Churchill passed through their house, welcomed by Kiki with the same nonchalant charm she used on her lovers and friends. Meanwhile, whenever she returned to New York, Paris, or London, she managed to find new lovers, not least of whom was the wild girl actress Kay Francis. They had a brief, intense lesbian affair in 1925, about which Kay wrote a glowing report for Kiki in her infamous journals later on. The most infamous detail of Kiki's life, the one that would cling to her reputation with the persistence of myth, was her addiction. Cocaine, heroin, morphine, she used them all, openly, shamelessly. That silver syringe, gleaming in her handbag like a decadent accessory, became both symbol and sentence. In fairness, cocaine and heroin had only recently been outlawed, and heroin was in fact a trademark brand name until that point. However, after the war, the authorities in various nations set their sights on what were known as drug fiends, and somewhat surprisingly, the aristocracy were not to be spared. But out in Happy Valley, there was little to worry about. Friends such as Margaret Cocky hooked up recounted evenings where Kiki would produce the syringe in full view of her guests and inject herself without pausing the conversation, as comfortable with morphine as anyone else was with a cigarette. The image is so startling it feels almost cinematic. A woman in silk, laughter around her, the momentary glint of metal as she punctures her own skin. She never made any bones about morphine, Cocky said later, digging the needle into herself while we sat up drinking whiskey. And still, miraculously, Kiki was off and up early the next day, fully dressed, radiant, as if pleasure cost her nothing. Her supplier in Kenya, Frank Greswold Williams, was a kind of colonial pharmacist outlaw, and until he died in 1932, he kept her well fed with narcotics. If supplies ran low, she was known to dispatch a private plane to fetch more. In a region where most settlers struggled simply to survive the climate, Kiki treated Africa as a glamorous outpost for her habits. Her beauty and boldness shielded her for a time, but notoriety was gathering like a storm. Amid that tempest, one relationship rose above all others in both emotional weight and consequences. Her romance with Prince George, Duke of Kent, the fourth son of King George V. They likely met in the mid-1920s, in Paris or London, through overlapping aristocratic circles. George was handsome, polished, musically gifted, and already developing a reputation as the most unconventional of his brothers. He drank heavily, experimented sexually with men and women alike, and was vulnerable to seductions that promised escape from royal suffocation. With Kiki, he found not just escape, but wild abandon. She introduced him to cocaine and morphine. The two slid into a pattern of shared intoxication that seriously alarmed Buckingham Palace, and it was about to get even worse. Gossip whispered that the affair included a ménage à trois with Jorge Ferrara, the bisexual son of the Argentine ambassador. The Windsors were on code red, and fortunately for them, they had plenty of practice when it came to covering up outrageous scandals. But young George was wilder than most, and Kiki was becoming a threat. By 1928, George's drug use had spiraled into something dangerous enough that the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VIII, intervened. He attempted diplomacy. It failed. He attempted family persuasion. It failed too. Then he acted with royal bluntness. He had Kiki physically removed from England in 1929 and warned George that any further contact would jeopardize him. It was about as close to modern banishment as you will find. Preston was told, get out of Britain now or face the wrath of the Windsors. She did leave the country. The affair officially ended, but it wasn't over. Years later, in Cannes in 1932, George spotted Kiki unexpectedly at a gathering and nearly relapsed into his desperate passion for both her and heroin, requiring others to literally pull him away like an addict from a flame. However, there was even more to the story that lay dormant for many years. Rumours persisted long after her death that Kiki even bore George a child in 1926, a baby secretly adopted out and raised by another family. The boy, Michael Canfield, grew up to marry Lee Bouvier, Jackie Kennedy's sister, as though he had a genetic homing device for power and libertinism. No documented proof has ever confirmed the story, but several figures close to the royals believed it and reaffirmed this over the years. For Kiki, it was one more ghost trailing her through life. For all its extravagance, Happy Valley was not sustainable, and neither was Kiki's velocity. The 1930s brought losses in brutal succession. Her beloved Jerry Preston died suddenly of pneumonia at the Hotel Pierre in New York in 1934, at age 37, the kind of death that is so swift it seems to erase the years before it. She returned to the United States often after that, staying partly in the Stanhope Hotel with her mother, drifting between New York and brief European visits, but unable to rebuild any sense of rootedness. Her social circle began to implode as well, as though some curse was descending on her. Her cousin William K. Vanderbilt was killed in a car crash in 1933. Then, her brother-in-law, Lewis Thompson Preston, followed Jerry to the grave in 1937, and a year later, Kiki's own brother Erskine was paralyzed in a car accident. They were dropping like flies, and it wasn't over yet. Her friend Jocelyn Hay, the 22nd Earl of Errol, was murdered in 1941, his death becoming the centerpiece of the Happy Valley murder that utterly scandalized the colonial world and finally began to shake the British public opinion that the empire was a benign presence in the world. It was starting to look like nothing more than a lot of wealthy people behaving very badly and very recklessly indeed. And I'll be coming back to the highly controversial Hay in a future episode, so make sure you subscribe if you want to hear all about his story. Alice de Janzé then killed herself in France by gunshot that same year. Classics of tragedy tend to concentrate loss into a handful of acts. For Kiki, life proved no different. Most devastating of all, her son Ethan, the boy born into that first Parisian chapter, was killed in 1944 while heroically serving as a pilot during the D-Day invasion. And then, in 1942, Prince George died in a mysterious, and some say suspicious, plane crash in Scotland while serving with the Royal Air Force. Whatever remained of her emotional defences had fractured by now. George had been a dangerous partner, but he had also been an anchor to a version of herself that once felt invincible. His death seemed to seal off that earlier, warmly glowing, morphine-soaked world permanently. By the mid-1940s, she was visibly unravelling, anxious, frail, and deteriorating under the weight of decades of narcotics use and unprocessed grief. Friends described her as nervous, haunted, sometimes barely recognisable, from the luminous woman of Africa. By 1945, the bright lights of the roaring 1920s had finally and fully gone out across the world. It was now a planet plunged into the dark mundanity of rubble, genocide, and war. The dancing was well and truly over. The Happy Valley set was dissolving into small pockets of survivors who seemed embarrassed by their former excess. Colonial Kenya itself was changing, chastened by war and edging toward political upheaval that would eventually make its European fantasia untenable. Inevitably, this expatriate band of self-appointed superiority had barely given a second thought to the lives of the Kenyan people, and they were now ready to kick the colonists back to their little island. The British people had on the whole come to a similar conclusion. Kiki, who had once embodied the high-voltage glamour of that enclave, now drifted between New York and Europe like a ghost from another century. The war had aged her, but it was grief that carved out the deeper marks. The unravelling of her set, the parade of suicides and murders that had already thinned her circle. Even addiction can be a form of momentum, a habit that keeps the body moving long after the spirit has surrendered. But now the drugs served mostly to keep her functional. There was little revelry left in them. She lived in a suite at the Stanhope Hotel in Manhattan, with her elderly mother nearby. Those who encountered them noted the disquieting contrast. Helen Steele, an aging matriarch keeping to a carefully controlled routine, and her daughter, once the dazzling comet of the interwar years, now a fragile presence, jittery and inward-turning. Her companion toward the end, a friend named Lillian Turner, described her as physically weak and emotionally brittle. She had episodes of panic, long silences, and flashes of agitation. If the Happy Valley years had given her the illusion of invincibility, the 1940s stripped it away piece by piece. Happy Valley, it seems, was a place name steeped in layers of irony. The modern world, with its ration books, its sober manners, its moral reconstruction, had little room for a woman who had once lived outside every boundary she encountered. And yet, there is something more complicated beneath the surface of her decline. Kiki had always been a woman who lived at acceleration, driven by appetite, curiosity, and recklessness, a wild Dionysian who set out to test the boundaries so at least everyone else knew where they were. If no one ever lived and felt like Kiki, then who knows, maybe we'd all try and end up in the same mess. To slow down was, in a sense, to face the very things she had always outrun. Addiction's cruel irony is that it can blunt pain for years while quietly storing it up, interest compounding. By 1946, the bill had come due. On the night of December 23rd, Kiki Preston walked to the window of her fifth-floor suite and quietly stepped into the void. She had been given a glass of milk by Lillian, who assumed Kiki was readying herself for sleep. For years, Kiki had injected morphine as casually as others might sip a nightcap. Milk, by comparison, felt almost symbolic, a gesture towards softness, some primal mother instinct, a return to innocence that had long since slipped beyond reach. Moments after Lillian left the bedroom, Kiki opened the window and jumped. Down in the alley behind the Stanhope Hotel, her body was found in simple silk pajamas. It was the uniform of surrender, stripped of glamour, stripped even of the persona she had built so relentlessly. Her death was at least mercifully instant. She was 51 years old. The newspapers handled it with that impenetrable post-war discretion. Socialite, big game hunter, descendant of the Vanderbilts, perhaps a sentence or two about her marriages. None dared touch the darker truth, the silver syringe, the royal affair, but it was not scandal they spared her, it was complexity. In their hands she became a footnote, a fall from a window, a tragic society ending. But not a story, not a real reflection of who Kiki was. Those who had known her, in Paris, in London, on the shore of Lake Naivasha, understood that her death completed an arc few lives ever traced so vividly. The girl who once walked through Idina Sackville's parties at midnight with a syringe in her bag now left the world as quietly as she once entered it, without audience or applause. Her mother, who had lived through bankruptcy, loss, and the early deaths of so many around her, now faced the unbearable task of outliving her own daughter. Only a few close friends attended the private arrangement. Whatever remained of Kiki's illusions vanished into a Manhattan winter. For nearly a decade after Kiki's death, her name survived only in whispered drawing room chatter, mostly among the remnants of the Happy Valley crowd, or in aristocratic circles where people still remembered the electric menace she brought into a room. But the world of the 1950s, preoccupied with reconstruction, conformity, and hard lessons learned from global catastrophe, had little appetite for resurrecting the tragedies of 1920s decadence. Yet the past has its own gravitational pull, and here was Kiki Preston, the American beauty known as the girl with the silver syringe, the lover who nearly derailed a prince. Many who later wrote of her did so with a moral undertone. But to reduce her to morality is to miss the human texture. Yes, she pushed past every restraint. Yes, she burned through lovers, fortunes, and her health. But she also lived in an era that celebrated abandon while punishing those who took it all too seriously. She played the role society cast for her, the dazzling libertine, until the script fell apart in her hands. Her life was a story without redemption, but not without resonance. And though she is no longer a household name, she endures in the uneasy admiration of those who recognize in her the perilous appeal of a life lived completely on its own terms. Well, there you go. One or two of you requested I do an episode on Kiki, and it was a great shout, very interesting figure. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to leave me a comment if there's anyone else you'd like me to cover, and tell me what you think of Kiki. I've been Chester, have a good one, and see you next time. Cheers.